The 10th Tuesday we talk about marriage. I brought a visitor to meet Muri, my wife. He had been asking me since the first day I came, when do I meet Jenny? When are you bringing her? I would always had excuses until a few days earlier when I called his house to see how he was doing. It took a while for Muri to get to the receiver, and when he did, I could hear the fumbling as someone held it to his ear. He could no longer lift a phone by himself. "Hi," he gasped. "You doing okay, coach?" I heard him exhale. "Mitch, your coach isn't having such a great day. His sleeping time was getting worse. He needed oxygen almost nightly now, and his coughing spells had become frightening. One cough could last an hour, and he never knew if he would be able to stop. He always said he would die when the disease got his lungs." I shuddered when I thought how close death was. "I will see you on Tuesday," I said. "You will have a better day then." "Mitch, yeah. Is your wife there with you?" She was sitting next to me. "Put her on. I want to hear her voice." Now I am married to a woman blessed with far more intuitive kindness than I. Although she had never met Muri, she took the phone. I would have shaken my head and whispered, "I am not here, I am not here," and in a minute she was connecting with my old professor as if they would known each other since college. I sensed this, even though all I heard on my end was, "Oh, oh." Mitch told me, "Oh, thank you." When she hung up, she said, "I am coming next trip," and that was that. Now we sat in his office, surrounding him in his recliner. Muri, by his own admission, was a harmless flirt, and while he often had to stop for coughing or to use the commode, he seemed to find new reserves of energy with Jenny in the room. He looked at photos from our wedding which Jenny had brought along. "You are from Detroit," Muri said. "Yes," Jenny said. "I taught in Detroit for 1 year in the late 40s. I remember a funny story about that." He stopped to blow his nose when he fumbled with the tissue. I held it in place and he blew weakly into it. I squeezed it lightly against his nostrils, then pulled it off like a mother does to a child in a car seat. "Thank you, Mitch." He looked at Jenny. "My helper, this one is." Jenny smiled. Anyhow, my story. There were a bunch of sociologists at the university, and we used to play poker with other staff members, including this guy who was a surgeon. One night after the game, he said, "Muri, I want to come see you work." I said fine, so he came to one of my classes and watched me teach. After the class was over, he said, "All right, now, how would you like to see me work? I have an operation tonight." I wanted to return the favor, so I said, "Okay." He took me up to the hospital. He said, "Scrub down, put on a mask, and get into a gown," and next thing I knew, I was right next to him. At the operating table, there was this woman, the patient on the table, naked from the waist down, and he took a knife and went zip. Just like that. Well, Muri lifted a finger and spun it around. I started to go like this. I am about to faint. All the blood. The nurse next to me said, "What's the matter, doctor?" And I said, "I am no damn doctor. Get me out of here." We laughed, and Muri laughed too, as hard as he could with his limited breathing. It was the first time in weeks that I could recall him telling a story like this. How strange, I thought, that he nearly fainted once from watching someone else's illness, and now he was so able to endure his own. Connie knocked on the door and said that Muri's lunch was ready. It was not the carrot soup and vegetable cakes and Greek pasta I had brought that morning from bread and circus. Although I tried to buy the softest of foods now, they were still beyond Muri's limited strength to chew and swallow. He was eating mostly liquid supplements with perhaps a bran muffin tossed in until it was mushy and easily digested. Charlotte would puree almost everything in a blender now. He was taking food through a straw. I still shopped every week and walked in with bags to show him, but it was more for the look on his face than anything else. When I opened the refrigerator, I would see an overflow of containers. I guess I was hoping that one day we would go back to eating a real lunch together, and I could watch the sloppy way in which he talked while chewing, the food spilling happily out of his mouth. This was a foolish hope. So Jenny Moody said. She smiled. "You are lovely. Give me your hand." She did. "Mitch says that you are a professional singer." "Yes," Jenny said. "He says you are great." "Oh," she laughed. "No, he just says that." Moody raised his eyebrows. "Will you sing something for me?" Now I have heard people ask this of Jenny for almost as long as I have known her. When people find out you sing for a living, they always say, "Sing something for us." Shy about her talent and a perfectionist about conditions, Jenny never did. She would politely decline, which is what I expected now, which is when she began to sing. "The very thought of you and I forget to do the little ordinary things that everyone ought to do." It was a 1930s standard, written by Ray Noble, and Jenny sang it sweetly, looking straight at Moody. I was amazed once again at his ability to draw emotion from people who otherwise kept it locked away. Moody closed his eyes to absorb the notes as my wife's loving voice filled the room. A crescent smile appeared on his face, and while his body was stiff as a sandbag, you could almost see him dancing inside it. "I see your face in every flower, your eyes in stars above. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love." When she finished, Moody opened his eyes and tears rolled down his cheeks. In all the years I have listened to my wife sing, I never heard her the way she did all that movement. Marriage. Almost everyone I knew had a problem with it. Some had problems getting into it, some had problems getting out. My generation seemed to struggle with the commitment as if it were an alligator from some murky swamp. I had gotten used to attending weddings, congratulating the couple, and feeling only mild surprise when I saw the groom a few years later sitting in a restaurant with a younger woman whom he introduced as a friend. "You know, I am separated from so and so," he would say. "Why do we have such problems?" I asked Moody about this, having waited 7 years before I proposed to Jenny. I wondered if people my age were being more careful than those who came before us, or simply more selfish. "Well, I feel sorry for your generation," Moody said. "In this culture, it's so important to find a loving relationship with someone because so much of the culture does not give you that. But the poor kids today, either they are too selfish to take part in a real loving relationship, or they rush into marriage and then 6 months later they get divorced. They don't know what they want in a partner, they don't know who they are themselves, or how can they know who they are marrying? He sighed. Muri had counseled so many unhappy lovers in his years as a professor. It's sad because a loved one is so important. You realize that, especially when you are in a time like I am, when you are not doing so well. Friends are great, but friends are not going to be here on a night when you are coughing and can't sleep, and someone has to sit up all night with you, comfort you, try to be helpful. Charlotte and Muri, who met as students, had been married 44 years. I watched them together now. When she would remind him of his medication, or come in and stroke his neck, or talk about one of their sons, they worked as a team, often needing no more than a silent glance to understand what the other was thinking. Charlotte was a private person, different from Muri, but I knew how much he respected her, because sometimes when we spoke, he would say Charlotte might be uncomfortable with me revealing that, and he would end the conversation. It was the only time Muri held anything back. I have learned this much about marriage, he said now. You get tested. You find out who you are, who the other person is, and how you accommodate or don't. Is there some kind of rule to know if a marriage is going to work? Muri smiled. Things are not that simple, Mitch. I know. Still, he said, there are a few rules I know to be true about love and marriage. If you don't respect the other person, you are gonna have a lot of trouble. If you don't know how to compromise, you are gonna have a lot of trouble. If you can't talk openly about what goes on between you, you are gonna have a lot of trouble. And if you don't have a common set of values in life, you are gonna have a lot of trouble. Your values must be alike, and the biggest one of those values, Mitch. Yes, your belief in the importance of your marriage, he sniffed, then closed his eyes for a moment. Personally, he sighed. His eyes still closed. I think marriage is a very important thing to do, and you are missing a hell of a lot if you don't try it. He ended the subject by quoting the poem he believed in like a prayer: love each other or perish. Okay. Question I say to Muri. His bony fingers hold his glasses across his chest, which it rises and falls with each labored breath. What's the question, he says. Remember the book of Job from the Bible, right? Job is a good man, but God makes him suffer to test his faith, I remember. Takes away everything he has, his house, his money, his family, his health. Makes him sick. To test his faith, right? To test his faith. So I am wondering, what are you wondering? What you think about that? Muri coughs violently. His hands quiver as he drops them by his side. I think, he says, smiling, God overdid it. The 11th Tuesday, we talk about our culture. Hit him harder. I slapped Muri's back. Harder. I slapped him again, near his shoulders, now down lower. Muri, dressed in pajama bottoms, lay in bed on his side, his head flush against the pillow, his mouth open. The physical therapist was showing me how to bang loose the poison in his lungs, which he needed done regularly now to keep it from solidifying, to keep him breathing. I always knew you wanted to hit me, Muri gasped. Yeah, I joked as I wrapped my first fist against the alabaster skin of his back. This is for that bee you gave me sophomore year. Whack. We all laughed, a nervous laughter that comes when the devil is within earshot. It would have been cute, this little scene, were it not what we all knew it was, the final calisthenics before death. Murray's disease was now dangerously close to his surrender spot, his lungs. He had been predicting he would die from choking, and I could not imagine a more terrible way to go. Sometimes he would close his eyes and try to draw the air up into his mouth and nostrils, and it seemed as if he were trying to lift an anchor. Outside it was jacket weather, early October. The leaves clumped in piles on the lawns around West Newton. Murray's physical therapist had come earlier in the day, and I usually excused myself when nurses or specialists had business with him. But as the weeks passed and our routine ran down, I was increasingly less self-conscious about the physical embarrassment. I wanted to be there, I wanted to observe everything. This was not like me, but then neither were a lot of things that had happened these last few months in Murray's house. So I watched the therapist work on Murray in the bed, pounding the back of his ribs, asking if he could feel the congestion loosening within him. And when she took a break, she asked if I wanted to try it. I said yes. Murray, his face on the pillow, gave a little smile. Not too hard, he said. I am an old man. I drummed on his back and sides, moving around, and she instructed. I hated the idea of Maurice laying in bed under any circumstances. His last aphorism, "When you are in bed, you are dead," rang in my ears, and curled on his side. He was so small, so withered, it was more a boy's body than a man's. I saw the paleness of his skin, the stray white hairs, the way his arms hung limp and helpless. I thought about how much time we spend trying to shape our bodies, lifting weights, crunching sit-ups. And in the end, nature takes it away from us anyhow. Beneath my fingers, I felt the loose flesh around Murray's bones, and I thumped him hard as instructed. The truth is, I was pounding on his back when I wanted to be hitting the walls. "Mitch," Murray gasped, his voice jumpy as a jackhammer as I pounded on him. Oh, when did I give you a B?" Murray believed in the inherent good of people, but he also saw what they could become. "People are only mean when they are threatened," he said later that day, and that's what our culture does. That's what our economy does. Even people who have jobs in our economy are threatened because they worry about losing them. And when you get threatened, you start looking out only for yourself. You start making money a god. It is all part of this culture, he exhaled, which is why I don't buy into it. I nodded at him and squeezed his hand. He held hands regularly now. This was another change for me. Things that before would have made me embarrassed or squeamish were now routinely handled. The catheter bag, connected to the tube inside him and filled with greenish waste fluid, lay by my foot near the leg of his chair. A few months earlier, it might have disgusted me. It was inconsequential now. So was the smell of the room after Murray had used the commode. He did not have the luxury of moving from place to place, of closing a bathroom door behind him, spraying some air freshener when he left. There was his bed, there was his chair, and that was his life. If my life were squeezed into such a thimble, I doubt I could make it smell any better. Here's what I meant. Here's what I mean by building your own little subculture. Muri said, I don't mean you disregard every rule of your community. I don't go around naked. For example, I don't run through red lights. The little things I can obey, but the big things, how we think, what we value, those you must choose yourself. You can't let anyone or any society determine those for you. Take my condition, the things I am supposed to be embarrassed about now, not being able to walk, not being able to wipe my ass, waking up some mornings wanting to cry. There is nothing innately embarrassing or shaming about them. It's the same for women not being thin enough or men not being rich enough. It's just what our culture would have you believe. Don't believe it. I asked Muri why he hadn't moved somewhere else when he was younger. Where? I don't know. South America, New Guinea, someplace not as selfish as America. Every society has its own problems, Muri said, lifting his eyebrows the closest he could come to a shrug. The way to do it, I think, isn't to run away. You have to work at creating your own culture. I don't know South America. Look, no matter where you live, the biggest defect we human beings have is our short sightedness. We don't see what we could be. We should be looking at our potential, stretching ourselves into everything we can become. But if you are surrounded by people who say, I want mine now, you end up with a few people with everything and a military to keep the poor ones from raising up and stealing it. Muri looked over my shoulder to the far window. Sometimes you could hear a passing truck or a whip of the wind. He gazed for a moment at his neighbors' houses, then continued. The problem, Mitch, is that we don't believe we are as much alike as we are whites and blacks, Catholics and Protestants, men and women. If we saw each other as more alike, we might be very eager to join in one big human family in this world and to care about that family the way we care about our own. But believe me, when you are dying, you see it is true. We all have the same beginning, birth, and we all have the same end, death. So, how different can we be? Invest in the human family, invest in people, build a little community of those you love and who love you. He squeezed my hand gently. I squeezed back harder. And like that carnival contest where you bang a hammer and watch the disc rise up the pole, I could almost see my body heat rise up Muri's chest and neck, into his cheeks and eyes. He smiled. In the beginning of life, when we are infants, we need others to survive, right? And at the end of life, when you get like me, you need others to survive, right? His voice dropped to a whisper. But here's the secret: in between, we need others as well. Later that afternoon, Connie and I went into the bedroom to watch the O.J. Simpson's verdict. It was a tense scene as the principals all turned to face the jury. Simpson, in his blue suit, surrounded by his small army of lawyers, the prosecutors, who wanted him behind bars just a few feet away. When the foreman read the verdict, not guilty, Connie shrieked. Oh my God! We watched as Simpson hugged his lawyers, We listened as the commentators tried to explain what it all meant. We saw crowds of blacks celebrating in the streets outside the courthouse and crowds of whites sitting stunned inside restaurants. The decision was being hailed as momentous even though murders take place every day. Connie went out in the hall. She had seen enough. I had the door to Murray's study close. I stared at the TV set. Everyone in the world is watching this thing, I told myself. Then from the other room I heard the ruffling of Murray's being lifted from his chair, and I smiled. As the trial of the century reached its dramatic conclusion, my old professor was sitting on the toilet. It is 1979, a basketball game in the Brandeis gym. The team is doing well and the student section begins a chant. We are number one, we are number one. Murray is sitting nearby. He is puzzled by the cheer. At one point in the midst of we are number one, he rises and yells, "What's wrong with being number two?" The students look at him. They stop chanting. He sits down, smiling and triumphant. The audio-visual part 3. The Nightline crew came back for its third and final visit. The whole tenor of the thing was different now, less like an interview, more like a sad farewell. Ted Koppel had called several times before coming up, and he had asked Murray, "Do you think you can handle it?" Murray wasn't sure he could. "I am tired all the time." "Now, Ted, and I am choking a lot. If I can't say something, will you say it for me?" Koppel said sure, and then the normally stoic anchor added this, "If you don't want to do it, Murray, it's okay. I will come up and say goodbye anyhow." Later, Murray would grin mischievously and say, "I am getting to him," and he was. Koppel now referred to Murray as a friend. My old professor had even coaxed compassion out of the television business. For the interview, which took place on a Friday afternoon, Murray wore the same shirt he would had on the day before. He changed shirts only every other day at his point. And this was not the other day, so why break out routine? Unlike the previous two Koppel Shaward sessions, this one was conducted entirely within Murray's study, where Murray had become a prisoner of his chair. Koppel, who kissed my old professor when he first saw him, now had to squeeze in alongside the bookcase in order to be seen in the camera's lens. Before they started, Koppel asked about the disease progression. "How bad is it, Murray?" Murray weakly lifted a hand halfway up his belly. This was as far as he could go. Koppel had his answer. The cameraman rolled, and third and final interview, Koppel asked if Murray was more afraid now that death was near. Murray said no. To tell the truth, he was less afraid. He said he was letting go of some of the outside world, not having the newspaper read to him as much, not paying as much attention to mail, instead in listening more to music and watching the leaves change color through his window. There were other people who suffered from ALS. Murray knew, some of them famous, such as Stephen Hawking, the brilliant physicist and author of A Brief History of Time. He lived with a hole in his throat, spoke through a computer synthesizer, typed words by batting his eyes as a sensor picked up the movement. This was admirable, but it was not the way Murray wanted to live. He told Koppel he knew when it would be time to say goodbye. For me, Ted, living means I can be responsive to the other person. It means I can show my emotions and my feelings, talk to them, feel with them. He exhaled. When that is gone, Murray is gone. They talked like friends as he had in the previous two interviews. Coppel asked about the old ass wipe test, hoping perhaps for a humorous response. But Muri was too tired even to grin. He shook his head. When I sit on the commode, I can no longer sit up straight. I am listening all the time, so they have to hold me. When I am done, they have to wipe me. This is how far it's gotten. He told Coppel he wanted to die with serenity. He shared his latest aphorism: don't let go too soon, but don't hang on too long. Coppel nodded painfully. Only 6 months had passed between the first Nightline show and this one, but Muri Schwartz was clearly a collapsed form. He had decayed before a national TV audience. Miseries of a death, but as his body rotted, his character shone even more brightly. Toward the end of the interview, the camera zoomed in on Muri. Coppel was not even in the picture, only his voice was heard from outside it, and the anchor asked if my old professor had anything he wanted to say to the millions of people he had touched. Although he did not meant it this way, I couldn't help but to think of a condemned man being asked for his final words. Be compassionate, Muri whispered, and take responsibility for each other. If we only learned those lessons, this world would be so much better a place. He took a breath, then added this mantra: love each other or die. The interview was ended, but for some reason, the cameraman left the film rolling and a final scene was caught on tape. You did a good job, Coppel said. Muri smiled weakly. I gave you what I had said, he whispered. You always do, Ted. This disease is knocking at my spirit. But it will not get my spirit, it will get my body, it will not get any spirit. Coppel was near tears. You done good. You think so? Muri rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. I am bargaining with him up there now. I am asking him, do I get to be one of the angels? I was the first time, Muri admitted, talking to God. The 12th Tuesday, we talk about forgiveness. Forgive yourself before you die, then forgive others. This was a few days after the Nightline interview. The sky was rainy and dark, and Muri was beneath a blanket. I sat at the far end of his chair, holding his bare feet. They were closed and curled, and his toenails were yellow. I had a small jar of lotion, and I squeezed some into my hands and began to massage his ankles. It was another of the things I had watched his helpers do for months, and now, in an attempt to hold on to what I could of him, I had volunteered to do it myself. The disease had left Muri without the ability even to wiggle his toes. Yet he could still feel pain, and massage helped relieve it. Also, of course, Muri liked being held and touched, and at this point, anything I could do to make him happy, I was going to do. Mitch, he said, returning to the subject of forgiveness, there is no point in keeping vengeance or stubbornness. These things, he sighed. These things I so regret in my life: pride, vanity. Why do we do the things we do? The importance of forgiving was my question. I had seen those movies where the patriarch of the family is on his deathbed and he calls for his estranged son so that he can make peace before he goes. I wondered if Muri had any of that inside him, a sudden need to say, I am sorry, before he died. Muri nodded. Do you see that sculpture? He tilted his head toward a bust that sat high on a shelf against the far wall of his office. I had never really noticed it before. Cast in bronze, it was the face of a man in his early 40s, wearing a necktie, a tuft of hair falling across his forehead. That's me, Muri said. A friend of mine sculpted that maybe 30 years ago. His name was Norman. We used to spend so much time together. We went swimming. We took rides to New York. He had me over to his house in Cambridge, and he sculpted that bust of me down in his basement. It took several weeks to do it, but he really wanted to get it right. I studied the face. How strange to see a three-dimensional Muri, so healthy, so young, watching over us as we spoke. Even in bronze, he had a whimsical look, and I thought his friend had sculpted a little spirit as well. Well, there's the sad part of the story. Muri said Norman and his wife moved away to Chicago. A little while later, my wife Charlotte had to have a party serious operation. Norman and his wife never got in touch with us. I knew they knew about it. Charlotte and I were very hurt because they never called to see how she was. So we dropped the relationship. Over the years, I met Norman a few times and he always tried to reconcile, but I didn't accept it. I wasn't satisfied with his explanation. I was rightful. I shrugged him off. His voice choked. Mitch, a few years ago he died of a cancer. I feel so sad. I never got to see him. I never got to forgive. It pains me now so much. He was crying again, and a soft and quiet cry, and because his head was back, the tears rolled off the side of his face before they reached his lips. Sorry, I said. Don't be, he whispered. Tears are okay. I continued rubbing lotion into his lifeless toes. He wept for a few minutes, alone with his memories. It's not just other people we need to forgive, Mitch, he finally whispered. We also need to forgive ourselves, just for all the things we didn't do, all the things we should have done. You can't get stuck on the regrets of what should have happened. That doesn't help you when you get to where I am. I always wish I had done more with my work. I wish I had written more books. I used to beat myself up over it. Now I see that never did any good. Make peace. You need to make peace with yourself and everyone around you. I leaned over and dabbed at the tears with a tissue. Muri flicked his eyes open and closed. His breathing was audible like a light snore. Forgive yourself, forgive others, don't wait. Mitch, not everyone gets the time I am getting, not everyone is as lucky. I tossed the tissue into the basketball and returned to his feet. Lucky. I pressed my thumb into his hardened flesh and he didn't even feel it. The tension of opposites. Mitch remembered that things pulling in different directions. I remember I mourn my dwindling time, but I cherish the dance it gives me to make things right. We sat there for a while quietly as the rain splattered against the windows. The hibiscus plant behind his head was still holding on, small but firm. Mitch, Muri whispered, ah, ah. I looked his toes between my fingers, lost in the task. I looked at me. I glanced up and saw the most intense look in his eyes. I don't know why you came back to me, but I want to say this. He paused and his voice choked. If I could have had another son, I would have liked it to be you. I dropped my eyes, kneading the dying flesh of his feet between my fingers. For a moment I felt afraid, as if accepting the words would somehow betray my own father. But when I looked up, I saw Muri smiling through tears, and I knew there was no betrayal in a moment like this. All I was afraid of was saying goodbye. I have picked a place to be buried. Where is that? Not far from here. On a hill beneath a tree, overlooking a pond, very serene. A good place to think. Are you planning on thinking there? I am planning on being dead there. He chuckles, I chuckle. Will you visit? Visit. Just come and talk, make it a Tuesday. You always come on Tuesdays. We are Tuesday people, right? Tuesday people come to talk. Then he has grown so weak, so fast. Look at me, he says. I am looking. You will come to my grave to tell me your problems, my problems. Yes, and you will give me answers. I will give you what I can, not always. I picture his grave on the hill overlooking the pond, some little 9-foot piece of earth where they will place him. Cover him with dirt, put a stone on top, maybe in a few weeks, maybe in a few days. I see myself sitting there alone, arms across my knees, staring into space. It won't be the same, I say, not being able to hear you talk. Ah, Allah. Talk. He closes his eyes and smiles. Tell you what, after I am dead, you walk and talk, and I will listen.